The following is a production of Texas Lutheran University. For more information, please visit tlu.edu.
Thank you to everybody that took the time out of Friday afternoon to show up. I see a lot of business people. I see a lot of non-business people, and I think that's fantastic. Two people I'd like to introduce today. First is a nice surprise for me is Scott Van Den Berg, Arnold's son, chose to join us today. Scott is President and Chief Operating Officer of Century Management. And Scott has well more than, I think, right at 20 years with the firm?
Yes.
Right at 20 years in the firm, more than 20 years in the financial business. And I'm guessing he's here to keep his dad under control. Century Management, for those of y'all don't know, is an investment management firm headquartered in Austin. They manage about $2 billion. They employ about 42 people, 17 of which are on the investment research side. And for those of you who are familiar with Bulldog Investment Company, you know, we are a value-based financial analysis, business valuation, and investment management internship. And you know, it's not too hard to figure out who the big investment managers are. And we had identified Century Management as being one of the ones that we respected. Arnold and his firm are widely tracked in the value investing arena. And I wrote him a letter back in January and said, you know, this is what my students do, and would you be interested in coming to Texas Lutheran? And I didn't hear anything. And I think almost a month went by and never heard anything. And I thought, well, he's probably just really busy. And then the phone rang one day, and it was Arnold. And he said, I really don't think you want me to speak. And he said, you know, I'm not a Harvard MBA. And he said, in fact, I don't have any college. And I think my jaw was on the ground at about that point, trying to cogitate how a man with no college education builds a firm that manages $2 billion without ever having the benefit of what all of us got at Texas Lutheran. And as Arnold proceeded to tell my story, or tell his story, my mind just went into overdrive about living 4 blocks from Anne Frank during World War II. All of us grew up with the story of Anne Frank. Then shared with me the struggles of his family being taken to Auschwitz, the most notorious of the concentration camps, the struggles of having to make it through all of that, and then to see where he is today. I just walked away from it with 2 thoughts in my head. Number 1, we have got to get this guy on campus. Number 2, where there is a will, there is a way. And if anybody epitomizes the concept of perseverance, it's Arnold Van Den Berg. That said, Arnold, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. If I can move that a little bit. Well, thank you very much, David. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's always a pleasure to share philosophies and things that you've learned, especially sometimes things that you learned the hard way. And as Dave mentioned, I didn't have the benefit of a formal training, and it reminds me of a quotation, which is one of my hobbies, is collecting quotations, is you either learn by wisdom and knowledge or in suffering and woe, and you continue to suffer until you learn. So one way or another, you learn. You have chosen the right way to go to college, to get an education, to be guided by people like Dave and the staff here. I chose a little more difficult way, but you learn either way. It's just a little bit more suffering. And after I realized that doing it my own way is the harder way, I started doing a lot of studying and gained a little bit of wisdom to help me along the way. But when Dave and I started talking, we started talking about talking to as an investment group. And then the story about my background in Holland came out, and he said, oh, you got to include that. And I said, okay. And then he said, well, the way you started your business, you got to include that. And I said, okay. And then we got to talk about the investment philosophy, and you got to include that. And then I started thinking, as I was putting this program together, Dave, how much time do we have here? And I'm not so sure all your students want to hear all this. So we decided to break it up into about 3 parts. So that's what I've tried to do, and I think it's going to take about an hour and 15 minutes to get through all this, if that's okay with you. I will stay as long as you would like me to stay to answer questions, and I have no problem if you ask me personal questions or anything about that. I'm happy to share that, because it is a true pleasure, once you've learned some great truths and they have worked for you, to be able to share them with other people and to know that that's going to make that path a little easier. It's just a wonderful feeling, and I'm always honored and pleasure to be able to do that. So starting off with my story, my mom was born in Poland, a very small town. My dad was born in Berlin, Germany. And my mom went to Germany as a young girl. She met my dad there, and they got married. And then when Hitler started coming up in 1933, my dad was a big student of history. He was always a little bit ahead of the game. So he talked my mom into leaving Germany in 1933 to go to Holland. And that was a big step, just to leave everybody in the family, move to a different country. But they did that, and then they started a business. My dad was a lady coat and suit designer. In the Jewish trade, we call it the schmata trade. It's a rag trade, is what they call it. My mom was a fantastic businesswoman, one of the best I've ever seen. It was just amazing what she could do in business, and I'll tell you some stories about how she even conducted business in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. So my dad was a fanatical designer. Everything had to be perfect. And my mom was the businesswoman, so she would sell the dresses and the suits that he would make. They started off at the end of a dirt road street, and after about 2 or 3 years, they had a big factory going. And they were very successful before the war. They lived on the Prinsengracht. And the Prinsengracht was if we can get that slide up, this is the home that I was born in. And there's a canal right along this, and this is about 6 blocks away from Anne Frank's. I'll show you the map. But that house is still there today. And you can see where we lived, and then that's where Anne Frank's house was. My daughter went to the Anne Frank Museum last year because her daughter was in a soccer game. And I'll show you the list of people that they have in the Anne Frank's. There is my family's name in the Anne Frank Museum. My grandfather is the first one, and then my grandmother, and then my name is the third one, Arnold. I was born 17/8/39. Then my dad, then my other brother, and then my mom. My family name was at that time Mandelberg instead of Van Den Berg. It was changed, and I had several names during the war. To be able to hide our identity as Jews. But anyway, so when the war started, my mom and dad went into hiding in the same kind of house that Anne Frank did. They lived in a little attic. It was so small that during the day they could barely stand there themselves, but they had a little room that they could leave out. But whenever there was a knock on the door or some neighbors coming out or people visiting, they had to go in that little room because nobody trusted each other, because there were some people who worked with the Nazis to turn in Jews. You never knew who it was going to be, so you had to be very careful. They lived in that little room for about 2 years under hiding. And they had a family that sort of let us live with them because my brother and I was 2.5 years old, my brother was 5.5. And so they couldn't keep the kids together because they would make noise. And so they had us live on a farm there with some people. And then the people didn't want to keep us any longer. They were too worried about us being caught and so forth. So my dad made an arrangement through the Dutch underground to smuggle me through the German lines. And the woman that did that was 19 years old at the time. She risked her life to smuggle me through the lines, and she had a fake passport but the passport was not very good. So what they did is they had a member of the Dutch underground sit in the booth before the Nazis would come on the train to check the passport, and then they'd get off when the whistle blew. So this man kept the German officer busy, asking him all kinds of mundane questions, and finally the bell rang and he had to get off the train. And she said her heart was just beating. Scott and I talked to her about 10 or 15 years ago, and she said her heart was just beating because if they asked to check her passport and they were caught, you know, then automatically she would have been shot on the spot. So anyway, we got through the German lines, and she dropped me off at the orphanage, and I stayed in the orphanage with my brother for the whole war. I was there from about 2.5 to 6. My brother and I were very close, and my mom had instructed him to take care of your little brother, and he was just a terrific brother. There was one thing you learned at an early child is that when you're hungry, it's all about everybody for themselves and survival. And so when we would go to pray and put our heads down, you learn to keep your eyes open, because if you didn't, somebody would steal the food right off your plate. And especially if you were a little kid, you didn't know what was going on, you'd hear all kinds of cries, "My food's gone." But my brother would always take care of me. He would take some of the food and he'd put it in his pocket, and I remember he would get me in the corner and he would give me a little food if I didn't get my fair share. But anyway, one day I woke up and my brother wasn't there, and he was gone. Nobody knew where he was, and nobody could help me with it. And that was probably one of the most traumatic times in my life. But what had happened is my brother was a little older. He was very talkative. He never changed. And he knew that he was Jewish, and he would go around telling people, "My mom doesn't wear a star." And he would let out things that would lead you to believe that he was Jewish. And the Germans were coming through Holland at that time, and they thought we were all Dutch Protestant kids. So they never bothered me, but they were afraid my brother would give the operation away. And there were a lot of Jewish kids hidden in that orphanage. And there was a wonderful family called the Chardon, and they were very religious Christian people, and they literally used their churches and used their influence to be able to move Jewish people throughout Holland. And they arranged for us to get through this line. And so they moved my brother to a farm, and I never saw him again until the end of the war. And so then I was all alone there, and that was a very tough time. The people treated us well, but there was not enough food and not enough water. And just to show you the psychological effect that that has on you, I went to visit my parents one time many years ago, and we decided to stop in a nursery to pick up some plants for my parents. And I was walking through the nursery, and all of a sudden, tears were flowing down. My back started going out. I got all nervous, and I just couldn't understand what was going on with me. By the time I got into the car, I could barely move because of my back pain. And I started thinking, what could that be? Something happened in there. So when I went over to my parents' house, I had been through psychotherapy for 5 years to learn how to analyze myself and deal with my problems. And I figured there's got to be something there. And all of a sudden it hit me. That plant in the nursery had the same smell as those plants we used to eat out in the field. So it brought me back to that time, and all of those feelings came out and literally put me out of commission for a day or so. As soon as I realized what it was, I started to clear up. So it shows you how childhood experiences can affect you even into adulthood. So it's obviously very important to understand that. Anyway, my mom and dad went into hiding, and so when my brother got moved from the orphanage to the farm, my mom, who is a very, very strong-willed person, had to know that my brother got there. And it took about 12 or 14 hours to get there, and they didn't have any phones in the farm. And they didn't have any phone in the place where my mom and dad were staying, so they had to go to a store to use a phone to see if my brother got there. Well, my dad convinced my mom, we can't take the risk because if we go out in the street, we get caught by the Nazis, then the kids don't have any parents. And she put up with that for a few hours. But after a while, she couldn't stand the suspense. She never heard whether my brother got there or not. So she kept arguing with my dad, we got to take the chance. I got to know that my son got there. I can't take it any longer. And my dad argued just as strongly. Finally, she said to him, I'm going to go and make the phone call, and if you don't want to go with me, I go alone. So my dad says he just had a bad feeling. He knew this was not a good idea, but he said he couldn't let her go it alone. I said, Pa, how could you know that this is going to happen? How could you let her do it? He said, let me ask you a question. Have you ever argued with your mother? I said, all the time. He said, one more question. Have you ever won? I thought about that and I said, no. He said, okay, that's it. Your mother makes up her mind. She's going, she's gone. So he went out there with her. There was an air raid. They had to go into a little shop to make the phone call. The lady called the Nazis, the Gestapo, and when they got out of the store, they were waiting for them, and they took them to the police station. And one of the things they wanted to do, and my folks had worked out the story between them, is they wanted to find out who was hiding the Jews, because that was the way they wanted to teach people not to do that. So they had made up a story between them that they were from Rotterdam. It got bombed that day, and they were just fleeing up, and they hitchhiked, and they got a ride, and they didn't know the people's name, and the people just dropped them off. And so my mom and dad said, don't forget, no matter what they do to us, we can't let them know the people who were hiding us, because that would put them into the concentration camp, and it would also leave the children without anybody to take care of them, because these people had agreed to take care of us. So they took my mom and dad and interrogated them. They finally came to my mom and said, okay, we want you to confess the truth. We broke your husband down. He told us the whole story, and now we want you to tell us the story. And she said to them, if you put me against the wall and shoot me, I'm not going to give you a different story. This is it, and that's all I know. I can't tell you anything else. And they finally believed her, so they said, okay. So that at least prevented that from happening. Then they took him to Westerbrook, which was a holding tank for people, and then they sent him on a train to Auschwitz. And the thing about Auschwitz is that when you got there, they had two lines. One is to the gas chamber, and the other one was to work. And the way they judged it is if you were kids, they would automatically gas you because kids couldn't work. And if you had the mother of the kids, they would gas the mother and the child as well. And so, fortunately, my mom got there without the children, and so she was spared. And they were both very strong people, so they could work. And I want to share with you one of the important lessons that I learned from one of my mom's girlfriend, who actually was on there with her, on the train with her, and actually they ended up sleeping on the same bunk. And she was a young girl at the time, and she had an argument with her mother. They weren't talking to each other. And so when they got to Auschwitz, her father went up to him and said, Beppy, I have a very bad feeling about this place, and we don't know what's going to happen. And if I were you, I would apologize to your mother. And she said, okay, Dad, I will. She went up, hugged her mother. They apologized and everything. She said that night she went to sleep. She couldn't sleep. She woke up in the middle of the night, and she was standing there. There was another inmate standing next to her. And she says, saw this big smoke cloud, black smoke coming up. And she says, geez, what is that black smoke? And she said, well, did you come there with your children? And she says, no, I don't have any children. She says, good. Did you come here with your parents? She says, yes. She says, well, I'm sorry to tell you that old people and children get gassed, and that is the crematorium. That's probably your parents in there. She said she went back. She couldn't believe it, but she said she thanked God that her dad got her to apologize. And she says, that's the lesson I always tell people when I speak about the Holocaust. To those loved ones, don't ever wait to apologize, because you never know when too late is too late. And she's always taught me that. And that's an important lesson, because it doesn't matter whether it's in a Holocaust or whether somebody dies in an accident. You don't want to ever let a loved one go without knowing that you are sorry for whatever happened. Anyway, my mom and dad were there 15 months. My mom was a very enterprising woman, and she learned how to do business in Auschwitz. And one of the things she did is she found out that there were Gentile people who were able to receive packages from their family, but their family didn't know they were in a death camp. They thought they were in a labor camp, so they'd send them high heel shoes and nice dresses and nice clothes. And she walked by a barrack one time and she says, can you imagine, here I get a dress with high heels. What am I going to do with that in Auschwitz? You know, you're walking around the dirt. So she said she got an idea. She figured if these people didn't value that, she could probably figure out a way to sell it to the guards and work a deal and maybe get a cut from that. So she went up to the people and said, look, I think I can get rid of this merchandise for you and get you some food and medicine, and I will do that for you for a piece of the action. So they were very happy to do that, and she said she studied all the guards in the camp, and she watched them very carefully to make sure that she got the right one, because if she picked the wrong one, she'd be dead. So she didn't pick the guys who were the red-hot young officers. She watched for guys who were a little older, maybe a bare belly, or their shoes were not very well kept. They looked like they really weren't into the program, didn't want to be there, didn't enjoy being there. And she said the first time she approached a guard, she said, do you have a wife or a girlfriend? The guard says, yes, I have a girlfriend. Does she like nice clothes? So the guard says, well, sure, any woman likes nice clothes. She says, I think I can get you some. So she brought the guard some clothes, but she didn't ask for anything in return. She just gave it to him. Next day, the guard said, Manya, that was really beautiful clothes. I'd like to do something for you. What can I do for you? And she says, well, we would like to have some food and some medicine and so forth. So that got her started. Then as she got more and more guards came to her and said, hey, I hear you can get me some nice things. And pretty soon she could get almost anything you wanted, including diamonds and clothes and everything else. And Beppy, who was the girl who she lived with or slept on the bunk with, she said, my mom used to kid around. She says, Beppy was my secretary. She would take care of all my business deals while I was making deals. Well, the ultimate, what she did one day was that my dad said he came back from a work party and he was just mentally down, he was physically down, he was hurting, he was just sitting there. He said, I felt like I was on my last leg. And all of a sudden, a guard starts looking at him. And he said, whenever a guard looks at you, that's never good news. So he just looked the other way and he told his friend, hey, this guard's looking at us. Don't look up, but this doesn't look good. All of a sudden, the guard starts walking towards him. My dad just keeps his head down. He says, are you Hugo? And he says, yes, my name is Hugo. He says, what is your Hebrew name? He says, my Hebrew name is Chaim. He goes, good. He pulls out his briefcase. He says, this is a package from your wife. My dad says, what? He says, this is a package from your wife. So here's the German guard delivering a package from his wife. So he says, what is it? He says, it's food. And he goes, okay. He said he thought it was a joke or something. So he kind of sat there. The guard was very nice, gave him the food, and he said, why do you need to know my Hebrew name? He said, oh, your wife doesn't pay us until we can prove that we delivered it. So anyway, that's the way she operated. She also made a market in garlic. Garlic, as you know, has 70 properties. It has antibacterial properties. And in Eastern Europe, that's a very common thing to use instead of penicillin. So people would trade their food for garlic because if they had an infection, that would help them with their infection. There's a lot of stories that I could tell you about it, and I know that There were some very gruesome things that happened, but the one thing I learned from my parents, and you learn from anybody, all their friends who did survive, some of their friends that survived, is that it was a big mental thing. You had to keep positive, you had to keep believing, and things got very tough. The one thing that I want to share with you that I thought was one of the most impressive things, which started me on a lifelong study of the subconscious mind, is that my dad was telling me about the death march. Now, I'm 5'8", he was 5'7". He weighed about 85 pounds. I weigh about 158, so he weighed half of what I did. He was skin and bone, and they went on a death march 60 kilometers, 20 miles. It was in the snow. The snow was halfway up to your ankles or halfway up to your knees. And you had to march, and you didn't get any food, no water, no breaks, and if your knee hit the snow, they shoot you. So my dad says he was going on this march. He was so tired, he was so weak, he was so faint, and then he had to carry his blanket, and then with the snow, it got real heavy. He said it felt like you were carrying a 100-pound weight on your shoulder. And the only way he could through, he says, you had to lock your knee like this, move forward, and then move and lock the other knee, because if you didn't, you were so tired, you would just go down. And he said the important thing was you couldn't think about how hungry you were, how thirsty you were, how tired you were, how much you hurt, or how angry you were. There's only one thing you could think about, and that was to lock your knee. No thinking about how far you had to go, no thinking about anything else. It had to be total focus on just moving that knee. And he says you'd be moving around, and all of a sudden you'd hear pop, and some guy next to you would get shot. And you had to just keep going. He said after 24 hours, they finally made it to their camp, and they gave him 3 days rest, and then they started all over again. So one of the important lessons you learn from the concentration camp of how important it is to focus on the now, to be able to use your mind, and the mind has incredible resources that I don't think anybody fully appreciates until they're tested. Anyway, my dad was liberated by the Americans, the Third Army, and my mom was liberated by the Russians. And I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to move a little bit ahead of that. The way my dad was, they were ready to go on another death march. This was quite a bit later, and his buddy was dying. He just couldn't go anymore, and they just leave him on straw and let him die. So he said to my dad, you know what, Hugo, you're not going to be able to make it through the next march. You don't even have any shoes. You're very weak. Why don't we just both lay here and die? And my dad thought about it, and he said it was his buddy, and he thought, well, yeah, he probably didn't care to go through another march. So he said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to hide under the straw, under your bed. So, and he says, you let me know when they're leaving. So they were pulling up the whole camp because the Americans were coming, and they were going to evacuate and move forward. So they roll, and they had tattoos on it, and everybody, the Germans kept impeccable records. Somebody was missing, they'd go looking for him. So they did roll call. My dad was missing, so they said, Such the Lager, that means search the barracks. And he said he heard these guys with their boots coming, and they would stick their bayonets in the and he was just laying there, and he says the bayonet would go like this, and finally they quit poking in there, and they ran back, and he thought, phew, he was saved. And then they reported back to the guard, and he told them, search it again. He said, this time he knew he couldn't make it. He couldn't be that lucky to be poking again. So he said he just laid there, and one time he almost felt the bayonet. He said it was so close. The guy pulled it out again, and they finally gave up looking for him. So he said he laid there for a day and a half because he was waiting for his buddy to tell him the coast is clear, but his buddy went into a coma. So he was laying there, and he didn't know, so he didn't hear anything from his friends, so he figured he still had to lay there because maybe they left the guard there. He said one time he was trying to think about what to do if he got out of the hay and there was somebody there, he'd be shot on the spot. But he said he was thinking about getting out of the straw, and just then he heard if somebody yell. He heard all kinds of fighting and guns and shooting and stuff like that. And he heard somebody say, "Brothers, we are free." And they said, "The Americans are here." So he got out of the straw, and his buddy was sort of half there and half not. He said between the two of them, they could walk. They couldn't walk alone, but by each one of them holding up, they were able to walk to the middle of the camp, and then they sent him to the hospital. And that's how my dad got out of the camp. My mom was freed by the Russians, so my mom got out 3 weeks earlier, and so what most people did is they'd go to the Red Cross, they'd register their name, and then the loved ones would find them. So my mom went to the Red Cross, and she didn't see my dad's name there, so she figured he didn't make it, so she didn't write her name down. So when my dad came down, he looked at the Red Cross, and she wasn't there, so he figured she didn't make it. So he's walking down the street one day in Holland, the town Amsterdam where they lived, and he saw a milkman pushing a cart up a street, so he figured he'd give him a hand. This is after he got himself back together. And he's pushing the cart up, and he looks at the guy, and it was his former milkman. And the guy says, "Boy, Hugo, what a miracle that both you and your wife survived." And he said, "My wife didn't survive. I checked, she didn't survive." He says, "No, I saw her yesterday." He said, "You did?" He says, "Where?" He says, "She's living with your friends." So my dad says they'd given him a few dollars or a few goldens, and so he went to buy some flowers. He knocked on the door, and that's where my mom and him got back together. Then they came and picked me up at the orphanage. And then we went to get my brother on the farm, and I think that was the happiest day when I saw my brother. We both hugged, and it was a great time. And so the family got reunited again, and we stayed in Europe for about 4 more years. My dad started his business up again. As soon as he had enough money, he came back and decided to go to the United States. And we moved into Los Angeles. We came over on a freighter, on a boat, and we landed in San Pedro. And that's how we got to America. I'm sorry that there's a lot of other stories that I could tell you about that, but we don't have the time to go into that, but I'll be happy to answer any questions on that later. So now, I want to move from what happened in Europe to how we got started here. So we came over here, but I was very weak as a kid. My brother was as strong as an ox. He lived on a farm. He had to help plow the fields. He was just the opposite of myself. And so I was very weak at that time, and we moved into a very rough neighborhood. It was the kind of school that if you couldn't fight very good, you'd either get picked on or beat up or something. And that was a regular ritual when I went to my high school. In addition to that, I had a lot of emotional problems, and so I never really was a very good student, to say the least. But anyway, I really bothered me that I was so physically weak and that I couldn't do anything. And my brother happened to be very strong, and so the coach in the gymnastic team got him to climb the rope one time, and he was the fastest out of 7 of his gym classes. So he got my brother to start climbing ropes, which was an event at that time in the gymnastics. So my brother said, "Why don't you come at the gym and, you can start climbing rope and build up your strength?" So I went and talked to the coach, and I said, "I'd like to become a gymnast." The coach kind of looked at me, and he said, "What we're going to have you do is start climbing the rope, and then when you climb the rope and you get stronger, we'll move you into the other events." Well, 2 years later, I was still climbing the rope, And I climbed very hard. I worked very hard, 2-3 hours a day, every day after school. And I wasn't making much progress. I was making a little progress, but even kids who'd never climbed before were able to beat me. And one time, we were sitting around in class, and all the guys were talking about what sport. One guy's going out for football, the other one's going out for track. And I told him I was going to go out for the rope climb, and there was a guy who was going out for the rope climb, and he was a strong kid, weightlifting and all that. He said, Van Den Berg, you're going out for the rope climb? He couldn't believe it, you know. And he says, well, that's what I'm going on. So I've been climbing for 2 years. I figured out I'd be able to beat him. So I said, well, let's have a race today. So all my buddies came out. It was the most humiliating thing that ever happened to me. This guy beat me so bad, he'd never almost seen the rope before. So I went home that night. I was almost in tears, and I actually thought about quitting. I said, I'm never going to make it in this. And then I had the thought. I said, you know, I may not be the greatest rope climbing, but I'm getting stronger, and I could tell the difference. I was feeling better. I had severe asthma at the time. That was getting a little better. So I thought, even if I can't be a good rope climber, I'm going to continue. Well, this was the greatest lesson of my life. The first lesson is you never give up and quit. Never, never, never. Because what happened to me after that was hard to believe. So I went up to my coach and I said, what can I do to improve my climb? He said, you know, there's a new technique coming out. There's a guy at Venice Beach climbing this way, and if I don't know how they do it, it's a new technique, but if you learn it, I'll work with you and we can develop it, and you've got the right figure for that, and you do very well at it. So I thought, okay. Took the bus to Venice Beach, waited there for 2 hours for the gym to start. Took 2 hours in the bus, and I waited 2 hours to make sure I got there in time. I waited for this guy to start climbing, and he didn't show up. I was so disappointed. As I was sitting there trying to figure out what I was going to do, he runs in there, he's pulling up his pants, he sits down, he shoots up this rope, and I'm just amazed. 4.5 seconds up a 25-foot rope. So as he was climbing, he climbed 3 times, I said to myself, I've got to learn how he's placing his hands, how he's moving his feet, doing all this. So all the way home on the bus, I was making sure I didn't have a camera to make sure I got that technique down. And then at night, I'd wake up and I said, geez, what if I forget the technique? I got to get there. So I would get up in the middle of the night. I would use my techniques as I was climbing up this rope in front of the mirror. And it got to be a regular ritual at night. I just couldn't sleep until I had really planted that in my mind. Well, this went on for a few months, and one time I woke up and I felt so good and so strong, and first thing that popped in my head, I said, I'm going to break my time today. So I got to Coach after school, and I said, Coach, I got to get a time today. I just have a feeling I'm going to break my time. Well, I took off. I felt like I was just sailing. It was just effortless. I knew that something had changed in me. And when I got to the top, I called down. I'm hanging there by one hand, 20 feet. Coach, what was it? He's looking at his watch, and he keeps looking at it. Finally, he calls out the time. It was such a dramatic improvement, nobody could believe it. So I said, Coach, how come it took you so long? He says, I just wanted to make sure that I was reading this right. He says, maybe there was something wrong in my watch. And I said, there's nothing wrong with the watch. I'm going to go and do it again. I did it 10 times in a row, hit it each time. So that was pretty persuasive that there was a major change. When I came down the last time, I said, you know what? I'm going to be the next Northern League champion. That was our league at that time. So I went up to the coach and I said, you know what, Coach? If I keep on improving this much until next year, I'm going to be the next champion. He says, wait a minute. Wait a minute. You got 5 guys ahead of you on your team, and you got the other guys from the other team. That's a long, you've done really good, but you're not there yet. And I was a little embarrassed about it, and I said, yeah, you're right. But I walked away and I said, no, this is it. I know I'm going to be a champion. So I worked out all year. The first year I climbed 8.6. The next year they shortened the rope a little bit. It's a translation, but I hit 4.3. I took first in the Northern League. I was tied for first in the Northern League. Next year I broke the school record, broke the league record, and I was never defeated but once in competition. I even qualified as a high school climber to climb in the national AAU, and I placed 9th in the nation in high school against college seniors. So I ended up climbing a rope, a 20-foot rope, in 3.5 seconds from a sitting position. So at that point, I realized that I had overcome my physical handicaps, and that was a tremendous thing. And while that was so important to me, I wasn't doing very well in school, never did good in school, so that was my next problem. After that, in order to work out some of the problems I had with anger and a few other issues, depression, I went to a psychiatrist, and the first thing I learned from the psychiatrist was really an amazing thing. When I told him about the rope climb, he said, you know, Arnold, the very thing you did, is what we taught. We teach that in sports psychology. You get an idea of what you want to do, you put a picture in your mind, you play that picture all in your mind, and you keep believing it, and you keep reaffirming it and reiterating it to the subconscious mind, and at some point that becomes subconscious, and at that point it drives you. And that's exactly what happened to me, and I thought, wow, this is the kind of stuff my dad used to talk about, using the mind. So I went and read everything I could get my hands on the subconscious mind, and my psychiatrist says, if you'll use the same discipline and the same hard work and the same drive and the visualization for starting your business, you're going to be just as successful. The minute he said it, I knew it. I had a feeling inside of me that there was a secret that I had learned from that rope climb experience, and I was living in a studio apartment. I cleared out everything out of the room. I put a desk in the middle of the room. I put all my charts and stuff about the stock market that I was studying at the time on the wall, and I did nothing but study day and night. I said, I'm going to treat this just like the rope climb. Day and night, I'm going to focus on becoming a good stock market analyst. So I tried to get a job in the field, and of course nobody would hire me. I barely got out of high school, so there was no reason for them in a brokerage firm or a financial firm. So I finally decided I'm going to start my own business, and that's what I did. So I put it in my mind, I visualized it, and I started working towards it. And if you can show the slide of the $2,500, they say it takes capital to start businesses, and that's true, but this is the capital it took to start Century Management. I was sitting down one day with a friend of mine who was also a client. I started off in the insurance business when I got out of school. Well, actually, let me back up. After I got out of high school, I was actually working in a gas station because I was interested in automobile mechanics, because I was very good at fixing cars and I enjoyed working on cars, so I thought I'd be a mechanic. I got a job in a gas station. One day that gas station went out of business, so I went looking for a job, and I ended up at Atlantic Richfield, and they had a job in the print shop open. So I went and got a job in the print shop, and I started running the presses, and I thought, geez, this might be a good business to go into. So I bought a press and studied it so I could break it apart and fix it, doing it at home in my garage. I became the supervisor of the department, but they wouldn't give me the job at the supervisor. It was temporary supervisor because a guy quit. And so I went in there and said, look, I can fix the presses better than anybody else. I can run it as good as anybody else. I'd like to apply for the supervisor job. I was 21 years old at the time. So the guy who was in charge of that department said, Arnold, you are the best pressman and you can fix it better than a dressograph multigraph, but the way you talk like a bebop guy. I can't have you talking to executive secretaries and executives in the field. So you need to pick up your ability to communicate. So I said, well, what do I have to do that? And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. You go take a speech class at school, and if you get anything better than a B, C is not acceptable. If you get better than a B, then I'll give you a 6-month trial to run the printing department. And then if you don't make it, we're going to fire you because we don't demote people here because that never works well working for the new supervisors. So you got a choice. You can go for it. I said, I'm going for it. So I went to the speech teacher at the local college and I said, what do I have to do to get an A in here? She said, oh, that's simple. I said, really? She says, yes. She says, every time I need a volunteer, I want to see your hand. I said, that's what it takes? She said, that's what it takes. And I said, why? She said, because the more you speak, the better you're going to get, and it's just a matter of practicing. So when I want to volunteer, I want to see your hand. I said, great. Didn't sound like a big deal to me. Well, the first night she needed a volunteer, she picks my hand and she has me read some things, and I don't even know these words that I'm reading, and I'm mispronouncing, and the whole class is laughing at me, and I'm thinking, God, this is not as easy as I thought. But it was a little easier than getting in a fight and getting beat up, so I thought I could handle it. So every time I went to that class, she had me volunteer, and that class would just roar. And at first time, I got a little ticked off at a couple of guys in the class, and then I finally realized, hey, they're just having fun, and they were pretty good guys. And so after a while, it got to be just, I'd go up there and let the people laugh for a while. But after a while, I got better. So at the end of the class, I said to her about a week before class, I said, am I going to get a B in this class? She says, a B? She says, you're going to get an A. I said, you're kidding. She said, no. She said, you are doing fantastic. So I was really happy, and so she got me aside after she gave me the grade. She said, I'd like to talk with you. And I said, okay, what's up? She said, you know, Arnold, I think you have a talent for this. I said, what are you talking about? All these people laugh at me all day long. You tell me I have a talent? She says, no, you ought to consider going into communication. I said, look, I just want this job in the print shop. I don't want to be talking on television or radio or anything. What the hell am I going to talk about? She said, okay, I just wanted to let you know that, but she says, I'm going to write you a nice report for your boss. So I go and take it up to my boss, and he's sitting there looking at it, and he keeps looking at it, and I thought, oh my God, I hope she told me what she was going to write in there, because he looked very serious. I said, is there something wrong? He says, I just can't believe this. She just wrote that you really did a great job. I said, well, am I going to get the job? He says, you got it. So anyway, I took over the printing department, ran that for about 4 or 5 years, and then realized I wasn't going to get anywhere in a big corporation, even though we were breaking records in the production and all of this stuff. I'd figured out a way we took our production from 88%, nobody had ever gotten more than 87% to 120%. And I couldn't get my men raises. It was a bureaucracy. They wouldn't ever advance me in the company because I didn't have a college education. So I had a talk with my mom one time, and she said, Val, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to make some money. She said, Val, there's only 2 kinds of people in this world. There's the yucca, and there's the business person. I said, what's a yucca? She says, a yucca is a guy like your dad. Ask him any question, religion, politics, music, mathematics, he can give you the answer. Can he make $1? Nothing. She says, now you ask me, do I know about religion, politics, music? No. Do I care? No. Can I make money? Yes. She said, so what do you want to be? Do you want to be a yucca, or do you want to be a businessman? I said, well, I want to be a businessman. I want to make money. She says, okay, so what's the problem? I said, well, what business am I going to go into? She says, what difference does it make? Business is you buy something, you sell something, you make a profit. That's it. She says, you give me anywhere in the world, I make $1. She said, I made it in Poland, I made it in Germany, I made it in Auschwitz, and if your pa would let me, I'd open up a business here, and we'd make a lot of money, because this is America. This is where you make money. She said, so go into business. So that kind of put a seed in my mind. One day I see an ad, be in your own business. I thought, all right, I got to go into this. So it turns out to be insurance selling, you know what I mean? But anyway, I was so ignorant of business and what was going on. The guy explained it to me, you build up your own clientele, and I thought, geez, that's great, and he showed me all the stuff. So I started selling insurance. I didn't have any clients, didn't know anybody, so I started knocking on doors every night. I would work for 3 hours selling at night. Anyway, what was really exciting is at that time the mutual funds were coming in the insurance business. And after a while, I figured out that the insurance business was not the kind of business I wanted in. I didn't believe in the products after I figured it out, that it wasn't necessarily a good investment. I started selling term insurance instead of whole life. But in term, you couldn't make any money. That's why most people sold the wrong kind of insurance. And I didn't want to do that, so I started selling the mutual funds. And the more I started the mutual funds, I thought, I finally found a business I could do, because this is what I believed in. You teach people how to make money, you investment professional money management, and boy, I could build a big business with this. This is what I believed in. So I got my license, security license, in March of 1968. The market topped in December of 68, and it went into a 6-year bear market straight down for 6 years. And by that time, I was so enthusiastic, I had all my friends into the mutual funds, and that mutual funds just went down and down and drip and drip and drip, and people lost a lot of money. The market went down 45%. Average stock went down 75%. And while I kept going with it, finally towards the end, it just was just devastating. So then I decided, God, I got to figure out what happened. So I made a real hard search to figure out what happened. And one day it hit me. I realized that the people who had done a good job during that decline for 6 years were all either students of Benjamin Graham, he's the father of security analysis, I'm sure you've heard a lot about him, and Warren Buffett, or they were practitioners of what they call the value school of thought. And I started reading about it and studying. I took everything I could get my hands on Benjamin Graham. I became one of the most dedicated students. And I finally realized that I had found the philosophy that I could believe in. And I said, this is what I'm going to build this business on, the principles of value investing, Graham and so forth. And I started in it. Then I thought about it. Well, how am I going to start this business? So I started talking to people, and I thought, I'm just going to set up my own operation. I started in my studio apartment, and one day I was having lunch with a friend of mine who was a mutual fund client, an insurance client, and I was telling him about my dream, that I had put it in my mind that I was going to build this business. And he said, Arnie, do you have an office? And I said, no. He says, why not? You can't do this out of your home. I said, look, I can't afford an office. He says, oh, you got to have an office. I said, he says, how much would it cost to start an office? I said, I haven't even figured it out. I can barely pay my home rent, let alone start and pay an office rent. So we kept eating, and he said, why don't we go back to my office? He was a pretty successful businessman. He said, I said, what for? He said, I want to lend you the money to start. I said, you want to lend me the money? Why? He said, because I think you could be great at it. I think you're going to do well, and I want to help you with it. I said, okay. So I was a little shy about asking for the money and so forth, and I didn't want to make it too much. So I figured, okay, a chair and a desk and a bookcase and, $500 a month rent for an office. So I put it all together. This is $2,500. I figured that's what it would cost. And in today's dollars, looking 38 years ago, it's probably about $15,000. He wrote me a check. I drove out of that parking lot. I thought, God, I can't believe this. But I called a friend of mine who was wanting to start a CPA practice, and we went out, looked for an office that we were going to share expenses together, and I started that way. So I went. It was 41 cents a square foot in the insurance building where I was, and then I read about Century City, and it was just like a ghost town. It was like Houston was 10 years ago with the real estate crash. There was buildings that were so over buildings, they were giving space away. So I went to the office, and I said, look, we want to rent an office. Guy was really a cool guy. I said, but I don't have much money, so I need to have, a pretty good deal. He said, listen, Arnie, I can get you a good deal, and I'm going to give you the office which is just perfect for you guys. This was the executive president of this big mutual fund complex that went broke. I mean, it was just a beautiful office, walnut panel and all that. And I thought, yeah, but, Clyde, I don't think I'm going to be able to afford it. And he says, oh, yes, it is. It's 41 cents a square foot. It was the same as in a junky building. So anyway, we were just elated. We signed the deal. And every month I'd be short of money. I'd go into his office and say, Clyde, no, I'm sorry, not Clyde, Curtis. Curtis, I'm really sorry, but I'm a little short. Can I pay you in 10 days? He says, whatever, Arnie, just give it to me. And I'd go in 10 days later and give it to me. And this went on for years. But they were really cool about it. And that's basically where I started my business, with this loan. And I don't mind telling you that things were very tight for many, 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 many years. But I eventually built up a clientele, people who believed in me, and I was doing very well. We averaged, first 10 years, we averaged about 20% return on our money. These are audited returns. But one night, my wife and I, my wife was my secretary and my assistant and everything else that needed to get done in there. And she was sitting there and she was doing the bills, and she got tears in her eyes. I said, what's the matter? She says, Arnold, I keep looking at the bills and they keep getting bigger and bigger, and the expenses are getting more and more, and I just don't know how we're ever going to work out of this. And by that time, I'd been reading about the subconscious mind. I read all about the programming. I believed in this thing that I learned from my rope climbing career, and I said, Eileen, there's only one thing I want you to think about. One of these days, we're going to become very wealthy, and I'm going to be a successful money manager. And she says, I know, Arnold, but you know, we got 2 children, and I think I'm going to get a job. And I said, no, you're not going to get a job, and I'll tell you why. The one thing I learned from going to a psychiatrist is that if you go to work, we're going to be paying this money out to a shrink 20 years later to fix whatever problems they have because they don't have parents at home. I'm working day and night. We got to have you at home. She said, okay. I said, give me one of your checks. Let me see the next check. I said, give me one of your checks. You notice the date on that? 1974. I wrote her out a check for $250,000, and I put on there, for something you like. And I wrote it out, and I said, here. And she goes, what's this? I said, that's a check for you in the future. Don't cash it this week, but one of these days, you're going to be able to cash it. And there it is. So about 8 months ago, she needed some money, and I said, you need more money? She said, yes. I said, yeah, I wrote you a check for $250,000. Have you spent it all? She goes, oh, I still have that check. I said, well, it won't do you any good because I changed bank accounts. But I said, I would love to see it because I would like to keep it as part of this story. So she gave it to me just about less than a year ago. And the point I want to make in bringing this check is, in order to build a business, you got to have faith. You got to believe that you're going to be able to do it. There's nothing more powerful than faith. And I can quote you from the Bible, I can quote you from the Greeks, I can quote you from the Upanishads, I can quote you from every major work that's ever been written, and they'll tell you the key to everything is faith. And if you can see that picture of your dream in your mind and believe on it and keep working on it, it's going to happen. And that's exactly what did happen. And today, we have a very good company. It's got a very good track record. We've averaged 13.3% for 38 years, and our stocks has averaged 15.8% on individual accounts. In other words, if you took the total account, it'd be 13.3. If you took the stocks alone, because we always keep cash, 20% usually, that's our return for the 38 years. I want to give you a couple of other examples as business students, because whatever you are taught in business, and I know these are sound principles, they don't mean anything unless you believe in yourself, unless you can see yourself doing it. That's the hardest challenge you got today, is to get yourself to know that what you put down and all this hard work getting through college isn't going to mean anything to you unless you can visualize and see yourself successful. It is absolutely the way it works. The world, the subconscious works looking backwards. You got to give it a picture, and then that picture has to be imprinted, and it's got to be so clear that you can see that. And That is the most important thing, and I'm going to give you two of my favorite stories to prove that. This is a picture of the Waldorf Astoria. This is my single favorite business story that I can give you to validate what I'm telling you. Conrad Hilton, contrary to what you might think, was born in a very poor family in New Mexico. His parents were trappers. They eventually had a little general store. They barely made a living. And Conrad Hilton started buying little apartments and building little buildings, trying to get himself going. And one time he went broke. He started a business and it went broke, and he was just literally, he said he was living on a loan from the bellhop. He had his clothes in hock. He had barely any money, and there was a gun-toting constable that was looking around for him to hang judgments against him. And then he saw the picture of this Waldorf Astoria. He said he was so struck in awe with it that he said one day he was going to own a building like that. He took a picture of it, and when he earned his desk back, he had that in front of him and said, "The greatest of them all." Years later, he was sitting there with his sons, and his son says, how were you able to accomplish everything you did from where you came from to have this success? And he said, my mother taught me to pray, my dad taught me to work hard, and that's what put it together. And his son said, I know a lot of people who work hard and pray hard, and they haven't reached the success that you have. There's got to be a missing ingredient. He said he thought about it, and he said he did think there was a missing ingredient, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He said one day he finally realized the secret missing ingredient. He was there at the 25th anniversary of the Waldorf Astoria. It became a Hilton Hotel. And he said he was more moved than anybody else. He said he was sitting there living a dream. And he said that can't fill a man with nothing but awe. He had taken this picture, put it on his desk, and 15 years later, the Waldorf Astoria became the Hilton Hotel. And in your handout that I have on the books, I have his story back there. And he said, you know what he said? He finally found the missing ingredient. You know what the missing ingredient was? You had to have a dream. You had to have a picture of that dream. That's what created it. That's what creates it. You create your own reality. And I'm sorry I don't have the chance to go into all of the machinations of the subconscious mind, but let me just give you a couple of facts about yourself that will just put you in awe. You have 1 octillion atoms in your body. That is 250,000 worlds, 4 feet deep in P. That's how many atoms. Each one of them is a universe made of molecules and cells. You got 50 trillion cells. Each one of them is a universe that is affected by your thinking. So by your thinking, you can direct this energy. It creates a broadcasting station, a receiving station. It literally creates your reality. And I have a bunch of quotes by quantum physics. I'm not suggesting I understand it, but I can tell you what they say. What they say is, if you were to ask me, speaking as a quantum physics, can I walk on water? Can humans walk on water? The answer is yes. They now can prove the quantum physics that you can defy natural laws through your thinking. And he said the reason people can't is because they have a little bit of positive thinking in an ocean of negativity. But if we were able to erase that, we would be able to do things that are considered miracles. I have come to the conclusion that all of the things that Jesus did were not miracles. They were of a mind that had the ability to transcend natural laws, and actually yogis and other Easterners are able to do the same thing. So if we had that level of enlightenment, we could do those things. They're not miracles. They are possibilities. So Conrad Hilton said it all started with a dream. My next favorite example is Billy Mills. And I want to tell you the story. This is just a wonderful, wonderful story. It chokes me up every time I talk about it, because Billy Mills was the same type of a kid in many ways as myself. He was half Indian and half white. He was not really accepted among the Indian people. He always felt badly about himself, but he developed a dream. He developed a dream of becoming a great runner. And he tells the story about how he overcame these things. But when he was training for the Olympics, there was a star there, a star runner for the 10,000 meter was Ron Clark. He was the undisputed champion. Nobody even got close to this guy. Billy Mills was just an also-ran who barely made it to the Olympics, just barely made it. Nobody thought he even had a chance. And this is what he said. Every day I imagined Ron Clark right on my shoulder, just like that. See, Ron Clark is the third guy there, right on his shoulder. Every day I beat him in my mind, so I went to Tokyo thinking like a winner. One of the biggest upset in Olympic history, and if you read his story and if you read his writings, he's right out of the book, the subconscious mind, the visualization, the believing that he was going to do it, and doing it. Now, here's what was really interesting. Ron Clark was truly a champion. They raced 5 times after that, and Ron Clark beat him 5 times in a row, then went on to do 12 world records. So you know that Ron Clark was the superior runner, but he was not the superior runner that day, because that's what he had in his mind. That's what he was committed to. I would like to discuss the investment philosophy now. And the first thing you learn about the stock market is there are risks in the market and there's opportunities, and everybody understands that. But the good news is that you can do a lot of things to quantify the risk. So the first thing we do is we think about how low a stock could go. We don't think about how high it can go. We want to know how low it can go because we're talking about risk. And just to show you that that technique works, for the first 30 years in my business, I only had one down year of 9%. 30 years, every other year was up. And the way we did that is by reducing the risk. You know, it's another thing that my mom taught me from the concentration camp. She said to me, you know, Arnold, if you don't take a risk, you never make any money. She said, I took risks in concentration camp that other people weren't willing to do, and they died because they weren't willing to take the risk because the food they gave you was not enough to survive. So you had to do something else to take a risk. And she said, that's what I learned, that if you want to get ahead, you've got to be willing to take a risk. But it's got to be an intelligent risk. It's got to be a calculated risk. You just can't do this blindly. So the first thing we do is we analyze the problems in the world. I got the analyst in the meeting about a month ago because we're going to give a presentation to our client, and I said, I'm going to tell them that we've analyzed every problem you can think of. We're going to put it on the board, and then we're going to go through our stocks and tell them that their analyst had taken all of these things into consideration when they make their calculation to know how low that stock can go. Well, as you well know, there's a lot of problems in the world. There's a fiscal cliff that's coming up. There's the problems in the Middle East. There's the potential Israeli attack on nuclear weapons. There's the problems of Europe, maybe even a breakup of Europe and the euro, and so on and so forth. But here's the good news. The good news is that we have plenty of history, 75 to 100 years of history, to tell you how low stocks can go. And I've got 38 years of personal experience to tell you how low stocks can go. And they can be quantified, not on an individual basis, but on a basket, 25, 30, 35, maybe even 40 stocks like Benjamin Graham taught. So if you've got 25 to 35 stocks, I can tell you with confidence that that basket is only going to go down so long, and then eventually it's going to go up. But I can't tell you about an individual stock. It may go more or less, and so forth. So how do we know that? Well, that 75 to 100 years of history includes 5 wars: World War II, Korean, Gulf War, Iraq, and Vietnam. So we know how low things can go if there's a war. Then we have 13 recessions with a duration of 11 months. So you can go through every one of these recessions and say, well, what were the multiples at the bottom? That's 2. Then we've got a time when we had a lot of debt like we do today. 1947, 112% of GDP. How low did stocks go because of that debt? Then we've got the worst bear market since the last 2009, and that's the 74 bear market, and that's when I started my business. I figured if things were that bad and stocks were that cheap, how could I miss? And I figured I'm either going to make a lot of money or I'm going to go broke. But the odds were clearly in my favor. So during that worst bear market, we had inflation of 12 to 13%. We had mortgage rates of 16%. We had blue chip stock drop 45%. We had the average stock drop 75%. We had a Nixon resignation, and we had price control. I can't think, even today, of a worse economic time. You know why? Because the currency was in question. There was 12 to 15% inflation, and people were saying to me, Arnie, you might be able to make me 12 or 15%, but that's what the inflation rate is. In 5 to 7 years, I'm going to be broke. So how do you answer that? I couldn't give him an answer, but I told him this. A company is made up of three major things: cash, real estate, property, plant, and equipment, product, but the most important thing is human ingenuity. Human ingenuity is what made this country great. You can take three major examples. You take Nike, it started with a couple of guys in a garage. You take Apple Computer, started with two guys in a garage, now a $500 billion company. You take Microsoft, started with two people, basically in very modest position, and built a $250 billion company. Out of nothing. There's even a Latin word called ex nihilo. That means out of nothing. I don't mean to imply that I know Latin. It's the only word I know, but it's a very important word to me. Because anytime I can learn how to do something out of nothing, I want to know about it. And that's what you can do. That's what human ingenuity does. That's what America offers. This is what makes us a standalone nation. There is no equal. Now, when I take all of that, I could say we've got all the problems covered, and so now I know how low stocks can go. We use 5 or 6 different measures to do that, but I'm going to cover you one more before. Now, let's take all the last bear markets out of 113 years. We've studied every one of them. There were 25 bear markets in 113 years. The lowest average duration is 17 months. The average decline is 35%. And the worst decline since the Great Depression was in 2009. That was 54%. Now, when you put all of this together and you study all of these individual periods and different techniques, you know that the big cap stocks don't go down more than 50% of private market value. I can assure you that with all this history. So that's a good thing to know, 50% of private market value. Well, what's private market value? Private market value is when two sophisticated buyers get together. This gentleman over here is the seller. He wants to get the highest price. I'm the buyer. I want to get the lowest price. He has his lawyers and his consultants. I have my lawyers and consultants. We sit in the conference room, we hash it out, and we finally find that midpoint. And that's private market value. And from that ratio, the big cap stocks only drop 50%. The mid cap stocks drop 75%. Small companies drop 75%, 25% of private market value. So when we go to analyze a company, we say the average decline in the market is 35 to 40%. The average drop from private market value is 75 or 50, 60% for mid caps, and 75% for the small companies. We use 6 different ratios. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, but I'll mention them anyway. Price to earnings, price to free cash flow, price to EBITDA, price to tangible book, enterprise value to sales, and price to sales. Now what we do is we then take the individual company. We know the general statistics, the rules of thumb. Now we take the individual company and we say, okay, in a bear market, in a bad situation, how low would this go? What's the private market? How low will it go? Then we go through all the multiples of the last 20 years and see what were the multiples actually at which gives us a confirmation of the market. In other words, one opinion on our side, we take one opinion, then we take the market's opinion, and then we compare them against each other and see if they check out. Now, why do stocks bottom? Why do they drop at 50% of private market value? How come they don't go more than that? You know why they don't go more than that? Because no matter what happens, people love bargains. No matter how bad things get, people are going to buy bargains because people are looking all over the world to place money. Now, the United States, the United States public, I'm going to show you later in the chart, has about $60 trillion of assets, net. That's after all expenses and all mortgages and everything else is $60 trillion. You hear about how broke the American people are and how in debt they are. Well, that's true. A lot of them are. But the net effect is it's $60 trillion. Doesn't sound like to me that America's going to go broke. The government may, but not the people. That's the hope of America, not the government, the people. Now, we are 1/3 of the world's wealth, so you got $180 trillion floating around looking for a bargain. And when that thing gets down to 50% of private market value, any businessman knows that that's going to be very attractive. So I'm going to show you how that works. So let's say that we are a company and we're a $100 million company. I got a $100 million company and I'm going to expand the sales 20%. So I can go out, hire salespeople, advertising, marketing, do all the things. It'll cost me 15 to 20% of sales to bring in new customers. That's one option. Then I got to have the manufacturing and all the other expenses. And by the time it's all said and done, if I spend $1, I'm going to end up with maybe 7 cents on the bottom line, many times only 5 cents. 5 to 7 cents on the bottom line. So all of a sudden, a $20 million company drops down, and their stock drops down to 45% of sales. Now think about that. It cost you 93 cents of sales to create this dollar, and now you can buy this company, the whole company, for 45 cents. Doesn't that sound like a pretty good deal? In addition to that, you get their customers, so you can take your products and sell them to their customers. They can take their products, sell them to your customers if there's synergism there. And now you're increasing the sales overall. And then in addition to that, you can merge these companies and reduce the cost and pick up even more profits on the whole deal. Wait, it gets better. Now, you can even, because your company is growing, it normally sells at 15 times earnings, but now it's going to be growing at a lot more clip. So let's say it goes to 17 times earnings. So now you've picked up $2 a share, and let's say this company has 5 million shares at $20 a share. It's a $100 million company. You pick up $2 on 5 million, that's $10 million. Now let's think what we have done. We bought 20 million of sales for 45%, so we call it $10 million. We get synergism, we pick up more sales, we pick up more profits. The value of our company has gone up $10 million. And so we've basically got this company for free because we've increased the value of the company. Now, it's not really free unless you own the whole company, but I'm giving you the idea. God bless America. Where else are you going to make this kind of money doing things like that? Financial engineering. So what happens is when stocks become bargains, people don't go out and create sales, they buy sales. And that's why you'll always have a buyer no matter how bad it gets, because companies are looking to deploy their cash. And by the way, today American companies have more cash on their balance sheets than they've had in the last 20 years. So that's what creates bargains. And once you learn the secret of analyzing how low they go, and I'm going to show you that, you're going to make money. Now, let me give you a simple analogy. Let's say you and the wife are going to go out and build your own home. Hire an architect, you're looking all over for the land, you're schlepping away, you're getting an interior decorating, lawyers involved, all kinds of aggravation. And all of a sudden you see the real estate market dropped, and you see your dream home for 50% down or 30% down. You say, you know, why should we build this house? Why don't we buy it? So now you buy, let's take a $150,000 3,000 square foot home at $150 a square foot. You're buying it for $75 to $100 a square foot. You save $150,000. It's not an identical home. It's not an identical twin. It's kind of a fraternal twin. It's almost close enough, you know? You don't need them to be exactly, and for the $135,000 you saved, you can remodel and move the bedroom around. So sometimes it's cheaper to buy than to create. And when it's cheaper to buy and create, you're getting more value. You know what you're getting. When you put out a marketing program, you don't know whether it's going to be successful. When you buy these sales, you've got them. So stocks bottom when their price becomes so attractive that they are selling below their replacement costs. And you know what companies find out? It's human nature. You go to a garage sale or you go to any sale, you buy stuff you don't even want and you don't need because it's cheap. How many of you have ever done that? Bought something you don't want because it's cheap. You just can't turn it down. Now, if you were entrepreneurs and you saw some company that cheap, you're going to buy it. It may not be a couple of dollars, it may be a couple of $1 billion, but you're going to buy it because that's what people want. They want bargains. And that's what I learned in the Jewish home was this very simple thing. I go to buy a shirt and I tell my mom, Mom, look at this new shirt I bought. She says, what price did you pay? I says, what do you mean what price? Whatever they want. She says, no, you have to buy it wholesale. So unless my mom wouldn't buy anything unless it was wholesale. So she went to Bullock's one time when we first came to this country. She says, you know, these American people, they are so stupid. I went into Bullock's and I offered to buy 3 sweaters. All I wanted was a discount. And they wouldn't give it to me. She says, look, I'm not just going to buy 1, I'm going to buy 3. I should get a discount. She says, no, we don't do that this way. She says, can you imagine this? She didn't understand that in Bullock's, they don't do the haggling that they do in a flea market in Poland, you know what I mean? But the point is, the principle is the same. You got to buy it at a discount. And that's the way we buy. When we buy a stock, we buy it at a discount. We buy it at a bargain. And if we can't get it at a bargain, we'll hold cash. So today we're in 28% cash because the market's run up a little bit and we are not finding as many bargains. But I'm going to show you one on the board. And this is a very big company. It's not the normal kind of company I like to buy because it doesn't have the potential of some of the smaller companies. No, the Cisco system deal. Anyway, this is Cisco's. You all have heard of it. It's got 78,000 employees, 71,000. It's a leading producer of internet working system, transport data, voice, and video, and it's one of the leading companies in the field. Do we have the chart?
Not that particular slide.
Okay, we don't have that particular slide. Okay. Anyway, let me give you the bottom line. If you take all their cash and pay off all their debt, $16 billion, you end up with the company and $30 billion in cash. So there's no debt. All the debt's been paid. That's like owning a home and having $3 million in the bank. Does that sound pretty safe? You don't have to worry about the credit card, right? Okay, so they got no risk in as far as the financial. They do $45 billion in sales. Now here's the way we priced it in. So we look at the problems today and we say, our analyst says, well, it's going to grow very slowly because the economy is very weak and it's not going to grow at 7%. So we're factoring in that Cisco is only going to grow 2 to 4%. So we put that into a projection. We have high unemployment. That doesn't directly impact them, so we're not going to mark them down for unemployment because of the fact that they sell to big business. But they have high national debt, and that's a problem. How does it affect Cisco? They sell to the government, and the government has a lot of debt, and if they're going to be cutting back, they're going to restrain their spending on that kind of equipment. So we have reduced Cisco's growth rate because of the high national debt. Now let's figure this out. At the time we bought it last year, the worst case was 14. We paid 16. Stock actually dropped to 13.3. So here's what happens. If it drops to 15, it's 19 today. If we drop to 15, we have 4 points on the downside and we have 14 points on the upside. That's the way we figure the risk and reward. As long as risk and reward is 3.5 to 1, then we're willing to step up to the plate. We want the odds in our favor. So 4 points on the downside, 14 on the upside, 71% up, 21% down, 3.5 to 1. So that's what we want, 3.5 to 1. Now that's what we want on big cap stocks. On mid cap stocks we want about 4 to 5 to 1, and small cap stocks we go 5 to 1 and more. Now, here's what happens. We bought Cisco at 16. The worst case was 14, actually dropped to 13. So we bought Cisco at 55% of private market value because the private market value is 36 and we paid 16, which is 55%. So that is a terrific buy. And even though I haven't put all of the calculations in it because there's 5 or 6 other methodologies to get to these numbers, that's the idea. Let's move on to the next chart, and I'm going to show you something that really thrills me. This is something that any student can learn. Like Peter Lynch says, all you need to do is if you got past the 5th grade, you can make money in the market, and I really believe it, because even though I got past the 5th grade, you wouldn't want to know my grades or the subject I studied. So I can vouch for that. Now here is something that is so simple. Every time I look at that, it thrills me. I have been keeping these statistics for 38 years. I've got them all on a page compared to bond rates and anything you can think of. And here is what is the most amazing thing about this chart. How many of you watch the S&P and the Dow when you're following the market? What's the market doing? Dow and S&P? Can I see your hands? Everybody, right? Well, the problem with that is it only tells you the price. The price is not important. It's the value that you want to know. You see what I mean? It's kind of like saying to you, what's this new car selling for? Well, it's selling for $30,000. Yeah, well, what is it? You know, what's it worth? Well, how do we tell that? Well, I thought about this for many years. I studied all kinds of different methodology, and I came to the conclusion that the easiest, simplest, and best one to use, and this is 39 years of history, I'm going to prove it to you. The problem with most indexes, they are weighed. So if they get very popular big cap stocks, they can move up a lot and they can influence the whole market and the whole index. This value line puts this out, and this is called the value median P income. That means it's not an average, it is the median. So even if things get ridiculous, you have the midpoint. Now here's what's beautiful about this. You notice that there's only 4 times when it hit 10 times earnings, and one of them was in 2009. The other ones were in those years there. But most of the time, it's above that. So 10 times earnings for the average metal bender, that includes 1,700 stocks, big, small, and medium, is 10 times earnings. Now, can you see why Cisco is a cheap stock at 10.3 times recessionary earnings? Because it's only hit 4 times in the last 35 years. The other times I'll get into later, that's a higher inflation rate with a 17% BAA rate, but it's 4 times. Now here's the other good news. The time it spends at 10 times earnings, would you believe out of 1,546 weeks, it only spent 1.2% of the time. So when you buy something at 10.3 times recessionary earnings, it's only going to be there a very short period of time. That's why we're willing to pay a little bit more, because we just might miss it if we don't. Now, at 10 to 11 times earnings, it only spends there 4% of the time. And at 11 to 12, it's 9% of the time. And between 10 and 12, it spends there 13% of the time. Now let's go back to the value line chart. So you can see this line here is the value zone. We want to buy in this zone, even though it may go lower, because this is the time when you're going to make money most of the time. Now let me give you an example. If you buy it at 12 times earnings and it's 13% of the time, that means 87% of the time you're going to make money. Not on any one stock, but on a basket. Now look at those statistics. Do you know anything else where you can make money 87% of the time? You buy it at 11 times earnings, and you're going to only be there 4% of the time, you're going to make money 96% of the time. Pretty good odds. You buy it at 10 times earnings, and you're going to make money 99% of the time. And that's why you don't need to have a lot of sophistication. You don't need to have a lot of knowledge. You just need to be able to buy these things on the right price and the right valuation, not any one stock, but a basket of stock. Now, you know, the sad thing is when the market got to 10.3 times earnings, people all over the country sold their stocks because they were scared, and I don't blame them for being scared. Unless you understand this, you're always going to be selling at the wrong time. But if you buy 10 to 12 times earnings, and by the way, earnings is only one metric we use. We use 6 to verify that this indeed is right. But when you use 6, you're pretty good. So, if you want to buy stocks, you buy a basket. Don't ever buy one. Diversify. Have 25 to 30 of them. Buy them at 50, 60, and 75% of private market value. You know that even in a bear market, you're going to go down 35 to 40%. You do that, you're covered, and over the long run, you do that. You know, the first 8 to 10 years, people were coming out with all this. I was learning more and more as the market, but I was making money because I was buying things this cheap, and there happened to be a lot of cheap stocks. When I started in 1974, the market was selling at 5 to 7 times earnings. I used to sit there with 30 stocks and thinking, this one's got a little better product, this one's got a little better balance sheet, this one's got a little better management. You know, I would agonize of which one to buy over 30. Hell, if you buy them at 5 to 7 times earnings, you're going to make money all the time. Doesn't matter which one you buy. So the whole secret is price determines your return. Always remember, it is the price that determines your return. Now, let's move on to the next subject, which is a big problem today, and that is the money supply. Now, the government is printing money, or they call it printing money. It's not exactly the right term, but this is unprecedented. This is 100 years in the Federal Reserve. This is the most money we've ever created. And here is the problem. If this money stays into the economy, it'll create huge inflation. Now, there's good news and bad news. The good news is, if you go to the next chart, the money is going into the banks. It's not going into the economy, and that's why we don't have a lot of inflation. And why is it going into the banks? Because the Federal Reserve is paying the banks a quarter on their reserves, so they can park their money at the Federal Reserve. They don't take any risk, and they're making money. So they're not lending it out into the economy, and that's why the economy is not going very well, and that's also why we don't have inflation. So why are they doing it? I believe the reason they're doing it, it's my opinion, is they're trying to make the banks more profitable so they can write off their bad loans. But there is a serious game they're playing, because when they pull that money back out, things are going to go down again, and they're risking a recession. So the key, whether Bernanke is going to be able to pull this off, is whether he can pull it out in a gentle fashion. Now, I want to give you an experience I had when I first started in business in '74. Inflation was going crazy, 12 to 15%. And there was an Austrian economist by the name of Franz Pick. This guy was fanatical. He had studied 509 currencies, and he spoke with this Austrian thick accent. He said, "When I tell you about these 509 currencies, they are all toilet paper." He said, unless they're backed by gold, they're toilet paper. Well, what happened is the United States in '71 had severed the link of gold. Nixon slammed the window down. It used to be that the definition of a dollar is payable on demand 15 grains of gold. That means you could go in and take your dollar and get 15 grains of gold. Now it says Federal Reserve note. What does that mean? Nothing. So now there is no link to gold, and that's why they're able to expand it like this. Franz Pick would be rolling over in his grave if he saw this. Here's what he said at a seminar. I couldn't afford to go to this seminar at that time, but I listened to his tape. He said, He said to the people in the room, he said, you know, you Americans, you amaze me. The government takes the gold and severs the relationship between the two, and you're sitting there and you're smiling. You should be in the streets with a revolution. I don't know why you don't put these people against the wall and shoot them. This is how fanatical he was about the relationship between gold. Now, here's the good news, if you show the next slide. This is the Japanese experiment. The Japanese ran up their money supply 8-to-1. We're only 3-to-1. They pulled it all out. They're pushing it back out. And look at the next chart. They had no inflation. So, if our government is able to pull this money out in a gingerly fashion, we can get by with low inflation. But the longer they keep it in there, the more difficult it's going to be. So that is obviously one of the things that we're monitoring very carefully. And if we feel there's going to be a lot of inflation, then we have to change our strategy, because when you have high inflations, your multiples don't go to 10. They could go down to 5 and 7 and 8 and so forth. So we'd have to change the strategy. But I've just talked to you about the problems. I've talked to you how we adjust for these problems, how we develop a worst case, and how we develop a risk and reward. The last part of this program, I want to talk to you not about the problems in America, but some of the things that are truly exciting about America, and one that'll eventually produce a major bull market, definitely in your lifetime, in the next few years. And you have a lot to look forward to. If I was your age, I would be telling you, get your money ready and learn how to pick stocks, because you're going to get very, very rich. I tell the guys in my office, the new analysts, I said, if you don't become a billionaire by the time you're my age, then something has gone wrong. You have a lot of opportunities here. Now, let's talk about making money. There's 3 things I love to talk about, and making money is definitely one of them. Here's how you create wealth. This is a chart where I've developed where I say this is how you create wealth. First of all, you create entrepreneurs. That's what this country is all about. You know, you get immigrants from all over the world. Do you realize that 40% of the Fortune 500 companies was started by an immigrant or his son? That's America. See, where else can you do that? Now, you create business. Business creates jobs, people spend their money, consumer spending, creates sales and profits. Companies invest in capital expenditures, and capital expenditures create productivity gains, and that is what wealth is. Productivity is wealth. Ex nihilo, out of nothing, we create wealth. This is just amazing. Now let's look at what a wealth machine America really is. Here you have a chart of the wealth in the United States. In 1980, we were worth $10 trillion. 1982, we were worth $10 trillion. By 2007, we went up to $65 trillion. That's after deducting all debt, including mortgage debt. We dropped into recession to $49 trillion, and we're worth $62 trillion today. Amazing. Think about that. All of this wealth created in the last 25 years. Why? Take a look at productivity, what it does. I'm going to show you 2 examples, and this is truly amazing. In 1840, it took 69% of the people in this country to produce enough food for this country. By 1900, it was 38%. 1930, 21%. You get the idea. It's currently only 1%. So we have 1% of the people producing food, and the rest of them are producing a lot of other things. They're creating wealth. That's how wealth is created. Now take a look at China. In India, 52% of the workforce is employed in agriculture. Look at the difference in productivity. 52% as opposed to 1%. Even in China, 36% of the people are employed in productivity, in agriculture. So you can see how advanced we are in the productivity scale. Now let's look at my best example of productivity. This is truly an astounding picture. Let me give you the background of this. When World War II started, America was caught flat-footed for the war. We were so far behind it was ridiculous. Hitler had been building a war machine for 10 years, and we didn't do anything to prepare for war. France had been overrun. Britain was on its knees at Dunkirk, gave up 50% of their war equipment there just to bail out their people. 85% of our equipment was obsolete. Hitler had overrun France and Europe. Holland was overrun in 5 days. In 1939, General Patton only had 325 obsolete tanks, and he didn't even have nuts and bolts for them out of the U.S. supply. He had to order them through the Sears catalog. Now, we started off the war, and we were only producing 1,000 planes per year. By the end of the war, we were producing 4,767 planes per year for a total of 286,000 planes. We were building 4 ships per month. At the end of the war, we were building 147 per month, and we built 8,800 ships. It took 7 months to produce a ship. It took 10 days. Now take a look at this picture. This boat or ship was created in 10 days. That is American productivity. And one time, Henry Kaiser, to prove his point, actually produced one in 5 days, but he said it was not sustainable. This is what America can do when they put everything together. And you know what brought this whole thing together? It was one man, Bill Knudsen, and another man, Henry Kaiser, in the shipbuilding. And Bill Knudsen was Henry Ford's right-hand man. He was an immigrant from Denmark, could barely speak English, and him and Henry Ford got into a hassle, so he went to work for General Motors. He started in the Chevrolet division, and he was a guy who believed in goal setting. So he took over the Chevrolet division, and they had him in front of all the people in General Motors, all the people on the floor, and the salespeople and everything, and they wanted him to give a speech. And he said, I don't give speeches, I don't know how to talk very good. Say, well, just tell them what you think. He got up there and he said, I want 1 for 1. What that meant is he told all the people in the company, for every Ford Henry sells, he wants to sell 1 Chevrolet. 1 for 1. That became the slogan. So President Roosevelt recruited him to set up the industrial manufacturing for the war, and he turned this thing into one of the greatest machines. And you know, Stalin, when he met with Churchill and Roosevelt, he held up his glass and he said, to the American manufacturing business, which we could not have won the war without. He readily realized that we did not outfox the Germans on the battlefield. We did not outmaneuver them. We overwhelmed them. That's how we won the war. And that is due to the productivity of America. So when people tell you that the country's got problems and so forth, yes, they do, but the country's also got a lot of potential, and that's one of them, productivity. Let me move into the next section, which is also due to productivity, and this is truly exciting. We are becoming, due to hydraulic fracturing, due to the productivity in hydraulic fracturing, we are becoming the lead producers of natural gas. In the next 5 years, rather than importing natural gas, we can actually be exporting it. This is a game changer for America. We are going to be attracting manufacturing companies to the United States because the energy cost is cheaper. Would you believe, for the first time, that there's a company from the Middle East, from Egypt, the largest fertilizer manufacturer that uses natural gas, is building a plant in Ohio because they can get the natural gas cheaper in America than they can get anywhere in the world. That is a game changer. I have a list of 10 companies in the last 3 or 6 months that are creating. I'm going to read them off to you real quick. Exxon is building a $10 billion plant in Texas. CF Industry is building a fertilizer plant, $2 billion. Dow Chemical plans to build a multi-billion-dollar plant in Texas. Royal Dutch is announcing a $2 billion plant. Orascom, that's the Egyptian company, is building a plant here and buying companies over here. In the next 5 years, as the way hydraulic fracturing is going, Now look at this. This is not a yearly chart. This is a monthly chart. We are, for the first 10 or 15 years here, we did not produce any more in natural gas production. And look what it's done just in the last few years. It's gone up to 2.6 trillion cubic feet. This means that we will be able to produce enough natural gas in the next 5 years to create 25,000 direct jobs and 450,000 indirect jobs. This is a game changer, and we are attracting people from all over the world to build their fertilizer plants here because of the cheapness in natural gas. Let me go to the next chart and show you how we're going to make money. Our cost, it's selling at $2 or $3 today, but our cost is really $4.50 per thousand cubic feet. In Europe, it sells at $11 to $13. That means for $4.50 in shipping, we could be making $3 to $5 per thousand cubic feet. That's enormous. In Japan, it's going for $15 to $16 per thousand cubic feet, and you can see the enormous profits they're going to make. So when you summarize all the things that America's got going for it, the productivity, the natural gas, and now we have another positive development, and that is that the housing market is bottoming out. Now, that is very significant. You can see the price of homes are going up. I don't think anybody questions the facts that the housing market is bottom. The problem is it's not going to expand like normal economies, because until we increase wages and have more people working, this is not going to be a dramatic return. But here's the good news. Directly or indirectly, real estate and home building affects 22% of the economy. It's been a drag on the economy. It may not be a tailwind, but it's no longer going to be a drag. So this is a very important development. We put a lot of money into home building on the basis that it was going to turn around, and that is definitely turning around. So that's a big positive for America. But here is the most amazing thing that we're going to see in America, and that is what we call 3D printing. Let me show you the first slide of Nike, what is happening in computer-aided manufacturing. Nike used to have 37 steps to create a shoe. We did it all in Asia because that's where we had cheap labor. They are now having computer-aided designs where they literally weave the shoe just like a sock, and then they slap it onto the sole. They are eliminating 35 parts of the manufacturing, and they can now produce shoes anywhere in the world as cheap as anywhere in Asia. So this means that a lot of manufacturing is coming back to America because computer-aided designs. But the most exciting about the computer-aided designs is what we call 3D printing or additive printing. And this is something that is, you just got to read about it and see what an amazing thing it is. This process has been around for about 25 or 30 years, but the machines were so expensive that they were out of the questions. But here's what they do in 3D printing. And we had a client who was one of the leaders companies in this design. You take an object like this pen. You put it in the machine, and the computer slices it like salami, reads all the things, and makes the blueprints. Then you pour the natural processes into the machine, and it literally creates the pen. You can take any mold of a car, put it in there, the computer designs it, and then it builds it slice by slice. The laser printing just keeps on printing until you have the product. Jay Leno has a whole hangar full of old antique cars, some of them 50 to 100 years old. He said most of them don't run because he can't get the parts. He now bought a 15,000 RD 3D printer, and he is printing these parts for his machines, and he's making these cars run just by the computer designing it. The most amazing thing about this is this is a lady's jaw in Holland, 83 years old. They scanned her jaw, and they made it out of titanium. The machine made it, and they put it in as an implant. So you can have a titanium jaw. The thing that they're really working on, which is 5 to 10 years away, but this is really breathtaking. What they're doing is they are doing printing with actual human cells. That means that they can take a human cell out of your body and keep taking those cells out and building them in the computer, and they can start to build organs. They are talking now about literally printing a kidney. Now, this is truly amazing to think that one day you can replace body parts with your own cells. And you know what the advantage of that is? The body has a natural way of rejecting any foreign tissue. That's the problem with transplant. I had a brother who is the longest living transplant person at UCLA. He was 23 years old when he came down with nephritis of the kidney. We did all the research. We came to the conclusion that the secret to transplant was the matching. Fortunately, he had a twin brother. We did the transplant, and it lasted 40 years. Most transplants only last about 8 years. So the biggest problem in transplant is rejection, and with 3D printing, and that's 5 to 10 years away, they are in the process of building body parts out of your own tissue. That's just amazing. Now, you can imagine the advantage to American manufacturing when they are able to produce all of these products over here instead of overseas. That means a lot of manufacturing jobs are coming back to America through this process. And here you can read the advantages of 3D printing. Up to 70% cost saving, quick production, less waste, better quality, accessibility, sustainability, and so on and so on. This is going to create a whole new industry of entrepreneurs. But let me say this in the final conclusion of this remarks here. The United States offers many things that countries can't match. First of all, we've got universal currency. We have no currency restrictions. If you were in China and you had a lot of money, you couldn't pull it out of the country. You either buy a property or you buy some gold or you buy some stocks. You can't take it out of the country. We have a democracy here. We have property rights, the largest and most liquid market in the world. We have the strongest military power. These are the factors that pull people, talent, and capital from all over the world. That's what makes this country unique. So in summary, while we have many short-term problems, there are many long-term positives. Productivity of America, natural gas revolution, the bottoming of the housing market, new methods for financing entrepreneurs through a stock exchange for small businesses, and the turn in manufacturing due to energy and low-cost production. These are the things that make America great, has always made it great, and let me give you an example of how that compares to other countries. China is having tremendous difficulties because of their production, because of their labor pool, and because of inflation and high unemployment. They are no longer as competitive as they were before. Europe is almost a basket case because they've got a whole entitlement program that takes 50% of the GDP. They are not competitive. We are becoming the most competitive part of the world, and with all this new technology, it's going to make that greater. Japan has now admitted that they cannot produce their cars and be competitive in Japan. They are bringing their manufacturing to America. So when you put all of these things together, while we may have problems, there are a lot of opportunities. I believe that it's going to take 3 or 4 years before these problems will be worked out. But when they are worked out, we will become the low-cost producer in energy and manufacturing, one of the countries where people want to put their money, their talent, and their capital. And because of that, we have a tremendous long-term future. And you guys are going to be at the tail end of this thing and ride it up all the way, because this is what America has going. All you have to do is look at the Middle East, look at Europe, look at China, and ask yourself, where would you, if you were wealthy, put your capital? Right here in USA. I hope I've given you a better idea what our strategy is during great difficulties, but more importantly, to make you aware of what a great long-term future America has. Thank you for your time.
Students at TLU engage in high-impact educational experiences that include civic engagement, aesthetic expression, critical thinking, and a focus on intercultural knowledge in a community that welcomes the interplay of faith and reason.